Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our class conversations. I think this is our fifth one, and we're very, very happy today to have Jason Moore with us. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Élika.
Thank you.
We're so thrilled. We've been working with your work and thinking deeply about it. I was telling Élika before that I was a bit nervous because the idea of the Capitalocene has changed the way I see the world. And now I'm like, what am I going to ask? So I will do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll start with some questions for you. For everybody who is tuning in and is not familiar with Jason's work, I'll say that he is an environmental historian and a historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he's also a professor of sociology. He is author of many articles and books, such as the very influential Capitalism in the Web of Life, and this book here, an actual paper book. Also editor of Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crisis of Capitalism, and with Raj Patel, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. We'll talk also a little bit about the question of cheap nature and others during this conversation. His books and essays on environmental history, capitalism, and social theory are very widely recognized. He's won a bunch of prizes, so including the Alice Hamilton Prize of the American Society of Environmental History early on in 2003, the Distinguished Scholarship Award for the section on the political economy. This titles are so long always, of the World System for the American Sociological Association, and the Byers and Burson Prize in Agrarian Change in 2011, and many, many things. He also coordinates the World-Ecology Research Network. All this information will be below on the information here that you have on YouTube, so feel free to learn more also at his website, which will be below. So, Jason, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for me as well. So we prepared a few questions, and as we were mentioning early on, really this class that we're doing is a literature class with many departures, I guess, from the very idea of how the study of literature is commonly understood and studied. So I guess, beginning with this context that is not geological, or so we think, would you mind telling us what the Anthropocene is? Why do you caution against using that word, and your proposal of using Capitalocene?
So the Anthropocene means literally age of man or age of humans. And there are 2 primary ways in which this term is used. One is in a specific geological research context, which is about the study of significant stratigraphic signals in the layers of the Earth to periodize eras of world or Earth history. Mm-hmm. And that's what I call the geological Anthropocene. Mm-hmm. And the debate right now is over whether or not those significant stratigraphic signals, sometimes called golden spikes, are clustered around the years 1945 to 1964, more or less, turning on chicken bones, plastics, and the residues of atomic testing. So these are the great geological achievements of modernity in one geological point of view. But in another, offered by the great geographers Lewis and Maslin, is 1610 and what they call the Orbis, or global spike. The Orbis spike is the low point in carbon dioxide concentrations realized after the genocides in the New World attendant upon the rise of capitalism and the slaving and labor recruitment forays into the countryside of the Americas. So what happened was roughly 55 million out of 60 million indigenous peoples in the Americas were killed between 1492 and 1610. And as a result, there was a drawdown in global carbon dioxide concentrations by about 6 or 7 parts per million, which is not a huge amount, but it was a contributing factor to some of the most severe moments of the Little Ice Age, which is a long period between roughly 1300 and 1850. And like any era, there were cycles within it. One of the worst and most intense or least favorable eras of the Little Ice Age was in fact reinforced by the Orbis spike and by the genocides that came from the invasion of the New World. That was wrapped up in a series of transformations that created the world color line, that were intimately connected with the gendered counter-revolution in early modern Europe, associated with the witch hunts, as Silvia Federici and others have made clear. It was also the era of the productivist reorganization of the Americas in a fairly revolutionary way. The acceleration of the Brazilian sugar complex, the sugar enslaving complex, of course, the African slaving that went with it, and then famously the Andean restructuring under Viceroy Toledo after 1569, organizing 1.5 million or reorganizing 1.5 million people to provide cheap labor for the mines of Potosi. So right there, I've suggested something that is not addressed in the other Anthropocene, which is the popular Anthropocene. And I call it the popular Anthropocene because it fits into a long-standing big E environmentalist way of reckoning with the world's problems, which is humans versus nature. And the humans versus nature argument tends to default into a view of history as either beginning in some mysterious past with a biological urge to procreate, which cannot be contained, and yet somehow was contained for 250,000 years or 300,000 years, or alternatively goes back to a techno-resource explanation of the Industrial Revolution as ground zero and year zero for planetary crisis. And I just want to telegraph at this point that the steam engine is not even the key machine of the Industrial Revolution. We'll get into that. But the popular Anthropocene has this man versus nature, and I do use man fairly deliberately, and we can tease that out, model. This is the language of anthropogenic climate change. And I say, wait a minute, it's not human-caused climate change. It is not anthropogenic, it is capitalogenic. It is made by capital, not made by humanity. And so the argument for the Capitalocene, that is age of capital, not age of man, says that we have to look at capitalism as a system, as a constellation of power, production, and reproduction in the web of life at every turn. And its origins can be traced stylistically anyway to 1492, the invasions of the New World, but of course are about far more than that. And I know that you are keenly interested in questions of material culture. So this is also, of course, the era of double entry bookkeeping, mechanical printing, the first wholly standardized industrial product in human history. This is an era between 1450 and 1750 in which every major significant dimension of capitalism as a system of power, as a system of accumulation, as a system of domination, but also as a way of organizing nature takes shape. So Capitalocene is a provocation, not just to Anthropocene thinking, but to the whole thread of Anglo-American and Anglo-European environmentalism, what I call the environmentalism of the rich, that formed most recently in 1968. There's a longer history to this that denies capitalism. There's a kind of climate denialism that is capitalism denialism, that is capital denialism. And so Capitalocene says, wait a minute, we have to look at capitalism as a way of organizing nature. And that's far more than the steam engine and coal.
Yeah. I mean, this in a way really ties nicely with our next question that had to do with the idea of world ecologies or world ecology. And you talk about a world ecology of power and reproduction in the web of life. So you've also mentioned the web of life in your answer right now. And as you know, We are dealing a lot with the World Wide Web in this class. So can you define a little bit what you mean by the web of life and capitalism being a world ecology?
So in a world ecology conversation, this is a conversation of activists, of scholars, of artists all around the world who recognize that not only is Cartesian dualism a mind-body split, it is also a way of narrating all of the master binaries of the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
And more than that, it is a way of pointing out that the intellectual difficulties and problems posed by these binaries, man and woman, nature and society, the West and the rest, go down the list. Those are not merely intellectual problems. They are not merely epistemic problems.
Mm-hmm.
They are centrally implicated in the actually existing exercise of genocide, domination, and capital accumulation in the drive towards planetary crisis. So when we say something like the climate crisis fuses and entangles at every point the carbonization of the atmosphere with the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid, we are not saying that one leads to the other. We are saying that they form a complex of carbonizing the atmosphere to such a point that we are in the midst of a major turning point. So the world ecology perspective says that capitalism contains an economic system, and it contains a way of sorting out humans and the rest of nature through humanity and nature. And I'll get to that in a moment. But it's so much more than that. It is a way of organizing power, production, and reproduction in the web of life. And we say web of life because, well, for a lot of reasons. One of them is to raise this question, well, what does that mean? It's not nature. When you say nature, everybody thinks they know what it means.
Mm-hmm.
The forests and the fields and the birds and the bees and
the
all of
months.
that. Yeah. What they forget is that at the core of modernity is a civilizing project. And we've moved from Christianizing to civilizing to developmental project across the past 5 centuries. And on the other side of that line is the zone of nature and savagery and the undeveloped and the uncivilized and the barbaric. And that includes not only the birds and the bees and the creatures that are non-human, it also includes the vast majority of humankind. And so fundamental to world ecology is understanding the long history of imperialism as a way of reclassifying most human beings, women, nature, and colonies, in the words of Maria Mies, into the realm of nature, the better that their lives and labors could be devalued in the interest of endless capital accumulation. So we're trying to draw these linkages between endless capital accumulation, the transformations of the earth, and long-term durable structures of domination and oppression.
Yeah.
I'm trying to tie that with the next question that we had, or I'm wondering if we should ask a different one.
No, I mean,
let's go with what we have. Yeah, we can, and maybe we can add some more when we're done with down the list. So this system, this Capitalocene, this era that you're describing, it survives, through the logic of exhaustion of what you call the cheap nature, as well as, the exhaustion and the waste at the same time. So given that these two actions depend on limited resources, as you were saying, nature, also humans, etc., what will happen when we run out of resources or space to put the waste that comes from this logic of exhaustion?
So there are two dynamics here, and one, and they've been narrated in rather conventional terms as nature as tap. So this is the resource question, and nature as sink. That's the waste question. And what's happening, and there are lots of problems with that formulation, but it suits to clarify some of the dynamics. What we are seeing with the climate crisis is the ways in which, in an increasingly nonlinear way, nature as tap and nature as sink are entering into a dynamic and self-limiting antagonism for capitalism. So in other words, the seemingly endless flows of cheap fossil fuel energy that are carbonized into the atmosphere are now inducing a whole range of disastrous and catastrophic real world impacts. As you know, in California, you see the wildfires, but also it's probably not a good sign when the Swedes, as they did a couple of years ago, brought in Californian firefighting experts to fight fires in the Arctic. So that gives you a sense of the drama of it. But part of what's going on is much more significant, which is in fact the end of the cheap nature model. And arguably the pivot of that is includes the ways in which climate change is suppressing the productivity possibilities of agriculture. That's less a problem in terms of the Malthusian scheme, because we know human beings are perfectly capable of reorganizing planetary agriculture to feed people. It is a clear and present danger to the capitalist agricultural revolution model that first emerged in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, which is basically this. It had different forms in the colonies. It was sugar and slavery. In places like the Netherlands and England, it was enclosure and dispossession in a very distinct way. But in both moments, the drive was essentially the same. It was to produce more and more and more food with fewer and fewer and fewer people. What we are now seeing over the past few decades with climate change is the yield suppression effect of climate change on agricultural productivity, which is a problem because capitalist agriculture is built on through the imagination of endless expansion, and that these agricultural revolutions will be able to endlessly reproduce themselves. And that's just not so. It's not borne out in the data. And oh, by the way, this is not only true for agricultural productivity, but for labor productivity across capitalism since the 1970s. So in answer to your question about exhaustion, it's very important. We have to step outside of the environmentalist and indeed bourgeois colonial resource manager mindset of we're running out of the substances. There is a substantial moment that is a moment of this process that is vitally geographical and geological and relates to how much lithium or how much copper or how much oil can be extracted given a certain resource flow and above all, a certain capital input. But we have to understand that these are relational questions within capitalism, within the web of life, and within how capitalism itself stretches its tentacles out in the web of life. And that means the one thing that capital cares about are the costs of production. And that's what's going on today in terms of the end of cheap nature. Climate change means that the long-term strategy of going to the frontier to find new, cheap, expanded natures of all kinds has come to an end, but it's actually much more dramatic than that. Climate change represents an implosion, a nonlinear reversal of that long-term cheap nature strategy of going to the frontiers. It's not just that the frontiers have run out, it's that they are imploding.
Yeah, when we were talking with Eugenio Tiselli, like I told you a little bit earlier last week, he was talking about the Capitalocene and he's very interested in the relation with agriculture. So he was talking about the concept of the Plantationocene, which was for me was also very illuminating. And perhaps maybe it's a way to tie into our next question that has to do with the need to move away from essentially the binary that is at the core of the idea of exhaustion between humanity and nature, let's say, to think of methodological frameworks of humanity in nature. And you talked a little bit about this earlier, right? So on the one hand, I want you to talk about that broadly. And on the other one, think of how we can apply this concretely to the case of, for example, human use of digital technologies. And I say this because they seem, well, we're interested in this class about this, but because they seem a priori to be alienated from these networks. And I'm saying this because at first they send this treacherous binary of nature versus technology, but most importantly, also because how digital technologies and digital information are promoted as being immaterial, a strange immaterial object that is accessible from anywhere. It has a sleek interface design that it's invisible, you know, you're touching the icons. And it's also based and it's stored in material infrastructures that are, you know, again, around this bogus narrative about also how not printing saves trees, so put it in the cloud. And there's a lot of manifestations of this. While on the other, of course, we also know that the internet alone is the second most polluting industry in the world. And I don't even know if that is actually true now after the current pandemic, where we're using it more than ever. So, you know, from hardware manufacturer, you know, the dirty technologies and minerals that you need to produce hardware, to all the power and dirty power that is necessary to keep hardware and, well, farmers down, I mean, cool and things like that. So could it be a place for the sort of digital tech in nature? Does this make sense? This question is, it's a little bit entangled. It's very tentacular.
Of course, digital capitalism is capitalism, and it is capitalism in the web of life. Yes, yes, of course. I think our first step always has to be to remind ourselves of the historical genesis of cognitive capitalism, of so-called the knowledge economy. And the truth of the matter is that the rise of capitalism in the long 16th century was itself powerfully enabled by, well, let's call it cognitive capitalism, but whatever term we want to apply to that, double entry bookkeeping, the cartography revolutions, the revolutions in, of course, the mathematization of the world that really comes into its own in the 17th century, printing and printing technologies, and the extraordinary increase in flows of knowledge that were enabled, not to mention that printing was itself arguably the paradigmatic industrial activity of the rise of industrial capitalism. And part of what you're hinting at is something that I would love to hear your thoughts on very much, is that when we think of the history of capitalism, there is a tendency to think about big machines. And yet, and I often ask this question in my lectures, why is it that we regard the steam engine and not the modern map as the key machine of modernity? And once we start to ask that kind of question, and then we start to ask questions about maybe not algorithmic capitalism, but certainly early forms of revolutionary forms of bookkeeping and quantitative imaginations. We know that the quantification was one of the sort of world-making innovations of what Max Weber once called the European rationality of of world domination. So we have a moment here, I think, to make connections historically, so we can see what's new and what's not. And the truth of the matter is that, yes, in terms of the 1%'s capacity to market to us, to surveil us, to use this extraordinary planetary physical infrastructure to pursue all sorts of ways of colonizing our imaginations and limiting our freedoms in ways conscious and unconscious, we want to find a way to see what's new, and to see how this extraordinary infrastructure is itself a battleground. It is a site of class struggle, and it's very much been to this point. And of course, as you know, and I'm sure you cover this at some point, the infrastructure itself is the result of the American drive for nuclear supremacy. And so the whole planetary infrastructure of GPS systems, not to mention the internet, everything else, was how do we build the capacity to win a nuclear war? And so we want to keep that kind of, that history, as well as the marketing, the gargantuan marketing apparatus, in our heads. And yes, linked to material life. It is material life. I think, see, even in this conversation, it's hard to really step outside of that binary, that somehow the world of cheap information is dematerial, which it's not. It may be the most material.
Yeah, that is kind of the exercises that we have been doing, because similarly to what you were saying, that we think of the steam engine and we don't think of maps, we similarly think of, you know, computers and iPads and cell phones as technology, but we don't think of the book, and this is, you know, in the kind of like literary context, as a technology as well. What has been interesting to do throughout the weeks that we've been doing in the semester was kind of has been to peel those layers that gets us to realize the radical materiality that any kind of literary or literary artistic discourse always has, and similarly is embedded in the history you were mentioning, the printing press, precisely in the histories of these material capital revolutions that started way before the Industrial Revolution, as it is. As it is commonly thought,
No, and the materialization that comes with digital technology being one that is based on fierce mathematization, right, and pure abstraction. But it's also this very, I don't know how to talk, but it's always a very distributed object, because it is based on electricity. It's ingrained in material surfaces. Yet there has a process of linguistic translation through different languages, right? Assembler languages, compiler languages, then programming languages and human languages. And then that gets distributed also into other devices that we experience. You know, this strange in itself, difficult ontology, because it's symbolic and it is material. And it is all playing on the one hand, selling the binary distribution between what's material and what's virtual. And the other one, actually, the body itself of the thing, of the digital object, cannot be separated. So it's, you know, it's, for me, it's a beautiful sort of enactment of the fallacy of the divisions and the actual unity of it all. So I think Élika has another question for you.
Yes, I mean, this is the perfect moment to ask that question. I mean, because something that we have tried to make really clear particularly with the selection of creative works in the class, the work of Eugenio Tiselli that we discussed last week, the work of J.R. Carpenter, the work of Joanna Moe, and so many others, really. What the works we selected do is try to draw attention precisely to that materiality that is beyond the, I guess, the magic, quote unquote, of the devices, the magic of the market, that kind of like seductive idea that technology has over how it presents any kind of reality or cultural production, for that matter. So in that sense, what are your thoughts about, the role of artistic practices that try to bring attention to, to material substrates on the one hand, and of course in this really distributed field that Alex was describing, and more specifically, how or what thoughts do you have in how we negotiate their potential to illuminate these very complex logics, while at the same time still remain extremely intertwined in the market, in the market of digital technology?
Like, can we do art at all? Is art important? Is art valuable?
I think so. And
we need tools.
I don't know that I have a sophisticated answer, but I can share with you that one of the great experiences of my life and a profound source of inspiration over the past 5 or 6 years has come from my interactions and conversations and teaching experiences with artists who, this was completely unexpected when I wrote Web of Life, which I thought would resonate with social scientists, and it has not, by and large. It's resonated with people who are interested in pushing the boundaries of representation, interested in interpretation and meaning, interested in a kind of creative and connective enterprise So that when in the world ecology conversations, we are asking how are the structures of capital and the dominant forms of representation and the struggles against those dominant forms of representation, how are they connected? Mm-hmm. That's just an example of the kinds of questions that we begin to open up. And so in my view, the arts, and I know that I'm telling you what you already know much better than I do, the arts, of course, are firewalled from the humanities and social sciences. And we struggle to find ways to make those connections and bring all of it together, sometimes better than others. Social scientists in particular have done an extremely poor job with this, and environmental social scientists, even those on the left, I think could care less about the contribution of the arts. I'm thinking especially of visual arts, but not only visual arts, to transcending the crisis of representation that we are living through in the midst of the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And at one level, that sounds very abstract, but I would ask people watching this to maybe reflect on what is arguably the dominant representational figure or form of the climate crisis, which is the J-stick or hockey stick chart, where you see urbanization, population, everything. It looks like a hockey stick. It starts to go up around 1850, and then it spikes after 1945. And that is an extraordinary element of bourgeois hegemony in the present era. It reinforces a sense of powerlessness, of helplessness, of inevitability that is fully endorsed by the Anthropocene perspective, this popular Anthropocene. So what we need, and I've been inspired to see artists especially valiantly experimenting and struggling with ways to I don't want to say correct, I want to say transcend, to move beyond this, to open up different ways of seeing, is we need a different way of seeing that speaks directly to the question of capitalism and that sensibility that so many people hold, which is it's easier to imagine the ends of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And that is exactly what the world's 1% wants you to think.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of how to imagine a livable future, when you're trying to imagine with the tools that modernity has given you very tightly to the development of academia and the academic, right? I mean, I'm talking of the academias of knowledge that are also so tied to the idea of a universalist discourse, of a universal truth. And all these things are so tightly together that when you think of art as opening another possibility of imagination, of thinking about speculative futures, of creative figurations, right? I think some concepts are so ingrained in our mind, like, you know, the capitalist idea, that it seems almost only possible to think through them as metaphor. And that, I mean, I know this sounds very esoteric, but in a way it's not, right? I mean, it's a way of also decolonizing. I don't really want to use that word so lightly, but of allowing, right, an alternative logic that is so hard to attain. And that's why I think the arts need to be in a closer dialogue with sociology, for example, as you were saying.
I regard the arts as really fundamental, and yet, it's so important, and you said it much better than I could. The university system works to fragment all of these fields, and it does so deliberately. So we see this with environmental studies, where you would expect to see an extraordinary flowering of unconventional and creative and heterodox approaches with the deepening climate crisis. And in fact, we've seen a move in the opposite direction. We see it not only with the embrace of Earth system and so-called coupled human natural system approaches. I like to quote Marx and Engels from the Manifesto, that coupling and marriage under bourgeois society is a form of slavery. We should keep that in mind. The coupling of humans and nature, so-called, which are false and ruling abstractions, that is a relationship of enslavement and domination, where the human which is, of course, overrepresented, as Sylvia Winter points out, but the human is limited to the bourgeois rational mind and then imposes its domination, both literally or practically and metaphorically, on the rest of nature. Is there. But what we have seen is a reinforcement of the prevailing orthodoxies. And this is even true amongst critical environmental scholars, especially in the United States, where a kind of full-throated defense of scientism and naturalism has been commonplace and is indeed the hegemonic position within sociology in particular. I'm a geographer, so I'm sort of an oddball in a lot of these social science discussions. But what geography at its best is about life, meaning, and struggles for justice. So it connects all of these fields. So I would say one of the things that we really want to push for is a connective and reconstructive and heterodox imaginary for how to deal with questions of justice that transcend the so-called social and the so-called environmental, because as we know, they are so intimately connected that we cannot sort them out.
No, we need magic. I know it sounds crazy, but I think we need magic.
Well, I think we're back to the European rationality of world domination, and that's a big R rationality, and it says that other epistemologies, other ways of knowing in terms of material culture and life ways are irrational. And so for me, I say, let us endorse the irrational, the so-called barbarian. We need to practice barbarian ecologies, not indulge in these older, these older slogans that I still hear all the time, which is, socialism or barbarism, or climate justice or barbarism. No, precisely what we need is barbarian ecologies.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end the conversation. Last week we ended with let's all become shamans. So now
yes, that's true.
Los bárbaros, vámonos a la barbarie. So
thank you so much, Jason.
Been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop recording.